Welcome to The Right Stuff. I am author Robert Bone, and today I'm going to read you the first chapter out of Secrets of a Broken Lineage. And this is just to give people a taste of the book, if you and see, kind of if you're interested, and just give you a little bit of a teaser. And if you if you like it, pick up a copy and read the whole thing. But I figured I'd at least give the first chapter and just let people kind of judge for themselves, as to how much interest they want to take. If you came across this video by itself, great. Otherwise, I'm going to make, or will have made, a short, a YouTube short, with even a smaller teaser, just kind of filter in people to the longer first chapter. So, this is Secrets of Broken Lineage, Chapter 1. Chapter 1, Alone. 1244 of the Ninth Age, SC. Gwendolyn shivered helplessly in the hollow crate beside the rising Stysis River. Its broken slats and rickety wood hardly shielded her from the pouring rain, but it was better than nothing, if only by a little. Her ragged and torn clothes were soaked. Freezing water pelted her face with each sudden gust of wind, sending more chills down her spine. A nearby bolt of blue lightning arced down, and the following crash vibrated through her chest. Gwendolyn shrieked. She pulled her knees in close with a whimper, and held them tight, rocking back and forth if only to take her mind off the storms. Defeated tears met the cold rain running down her face. She considered trying to find a better crate, but she knew the effort would end in futility. The trading dock held many large wooden boxes, most of them nailed closed and ready to be shipped down south with the flow of the river. The only ones left open were just as bad or worse than this one. She often wondered what sort of interesting things she could find in the closed boxes. It hardly mattered, since she could never find a tool to pry them open, and even if she did, her 9-year-old body didn't possess enough strength to use it properly. She was lucky to find one with the overhead slats still intact. Gwendolyn cursed herself. Whenever she made her way to this side of Timlin, the trading docks was her go-to place to curl up in a quiet corner until morning. Stacked crates provided plenty of hiding spots for a good sleep. Tonight, however, she had ignored her sense to seek better shelter when she noticed the threatening clouds rolling in. As it so often did during difficult times, a familiar image emerged from the depths of her memories. The face of a man with a trimmed and neat mustache looked down at her, smiling. His short, tidied hair hid beneath a brown leather cavalier hat, and the dashing crimson plume attached to it bounced playfully with each step. Gentle and soft, his voice rang in her head as clearly as it had on that day. "Dearest Gwendolyn, I have something special for you." A woman walked on the other side of this man, frowning, as he plucked a sizable treat from his jacket and handed it to his daughter. "I wish you wouldn't give her so many treats, dear. She had one earlier today," she said. Though her mother's face contorted as she lectured her father on giving her sweets she didn't need, her face remained beautiful and loving. The silken scarf pulled around her curled auburn hair fluttered in the wind, and she gripped its edges tight as they walked down the road. Gwendolyn's father chuckled, making a passing comment of how she would only be 6 years old once, and that children her age needed sweets to become well-balanced adults. Sighing, her mother threw up a hand in concession. Her father cast a glance at her and winked from beneath the wide brim of his hat. Gwendolyn shuttered her eyes. Doing so never failed to strengthen the image, but the reaction was involuntary. She knew what would come next. She fought against the memory snaking its way through her mind. It was tenacious in its hold on her, no matter how much effort she summoned to push it away. The lonely country road to home suddenly filled with bandits. Arrows quickly filled her father's chest. Her mother screamed as she ran toward them, but several brutes caught her and lifted her from the ground. The scarf let loose from her auburn hair and landed in the mud at Gwendolyn's feet. She could do nothing. Her feet wouldn't move. Her mother screamed again, her horrified expression halting Gwendolyn's heart as she reached out to her husband and daughter while the bandits carried her off into the dark woods. Finally, one foot stepped forward. She needed to go after them, but her other would not follow. A horse-drawn wagon raced out from behind the trees and brush, pulling behind it a cage filled with prisoners. She spotted her mother amongst them, and in a brief instant her panicked and mournful expression showing through the iron bars, met her own shocked face. The wagon rode out of sight as she stood there, helpless. They had gone. Gwendolyn picked up the dirtied scarf, hands trembling violently, and knelt beside her father, crying and willing her hands to stop shaking so she could feel the slowing rhythm of his dying breaths. His voice came weak as he turned to her. "My dear Gwen, I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry." The final breath left his lungs, and the strong hand gripping hers loosened. Gwendolyn opened her eyes with a gasp. Her head touched her knees as she clutched her legs even closer to her body. The only memory of her parents was their cruel and untimely departures. She longed to be rid of it, and yet she knew how impossible it would be to rid herself of the sole thing she possessed of them. 3 years later, and every time the images entered her mind, they felt as real as the day they occurred. Gwendolyn fought back tears, remembering how a kind merchant took pity on her and brought her back to Timlin before sundown. Even with his company, she feared for her life the whole way, always looking over her shoulder, fighting through the shock and confusion. The merchant dropped her off at the towering city gates, where she begged the guards for help. She remembered their faces. They were sad, filled with regret. Yet the guards remained stationary at their post. They shook their heads and told her there was nothing they could do except report it to the sovereign. A new group of nasty lackeys had filtered into the city. An elusive figure led them from the shadows, one whom no one had yet identified. The city guard only knew that such lackeys certainly weren't smart enough to organize themselves. Since that time, Gwendolyn held little hope of ever finding her mother. Rumor continued to grow until confirmation reached Timlin of a twisted sorcerer living far to the south. The elusive leader had been working with them, providing live subjects for experiment, and had been rounding up people near Timlin and other cities in the central region for the past few years. They often disposed of those who might resist, and took easy prey to avoid a drawn-out struggle when capture needed to be quick. Three years had she spent living on the streets of Timlin as little more than a despised urchin. She fought hard to survive. Every discarded scrap of bread, every stolen piece of fruit, and every cut of meat left for the dogs was foraged with blood, sweat, and quite a few tears. Some amount of fortune found her in the early years. She was hardly the only orphan child living on the streets of Timlin. Not all of them were friendly, but a collective few grouped together and formed a family of sorts that looked out for one another. With their help, she learned how to survive, how to become hardened to the harsh reality of her situation. Despite looking out for each other, each individual had to fight for their own basic needs, a thing that would perplex Gwendolyn for years to come. Why they never lived together and formed a stronger bond of family and friendship, she never understood. It would have made sense, and for all anyone knew, it would have given them the strength and ever-distant hope they needed. Still, for all the hardship and for all the battles she fought just to survive the unforgiving streets of the shining city, she couldn't help but find grains of solace amidst the pain. As the torrent continued to drench the trading dock, the nearby Stysis River threatened to spill over the stone bank. The soft glow of firelight appeared upstream. Gwendolyn stirred from her heavy thoughts and scuttled back. She nearly forgot her shabby home had neither front nor rear panels, and stuck her already soaked back out into the pounding rain. Watching close, the light stopped and waited. A sharp rap on another crate sounded 3 times in quick succession, then twice, with a longer pause between them. Gwendolyn returned with 6 knocks at a steady pace. The light bounced through the heavy rainfall, and quick feet splashed through the deep, growing puddles along the stone path. An unwieldy oil lantern reached her and nearly touched her on the nose as it lit the rugged yet handsome face of a young boy hardly in his teen years. "That you, Bandit?" he said with a warm smile. The unwritten rule amongst Timlin urchins was that you were called by what made you an orphan. It bordered on cruelty, but Gwendolyn found, as did they all, that it somehow gave her strength to fight another day. She sniffed. "Hi, Abandon." Abandon had been left on the streets of Timlin at about the same age as her. He tended to dodge questions about what happened, and when he did reply, he usually claimed he couldn't remember. What little she could gather of his rarely truthful comments on the subject, his parents left him for no apparent reason, and he found no trace of them years later when he located his old home. Abandoned, or Abe, as Gwendolyn often called him, was one of the older orphans, who many of the others looked up to as a father figure of sorts. Responsible and caring, Abe had been the most important person to her during her earlier years on the streets. He found her soon after that terrible day and took her under his wing. "I swear, your attraction to this place is going to get you in more trouble than it's worth one of these days." "I like it," she protested. "The tradesmen don't come until late morning and only work until early evening. Just so happens it's not great when it rains," she said with another sniff. "I told you, Bandit, the back alleys south of Gurney Road are good for storms. Plenty of overhead and low traffic in the mornings." Abandon was right, of course. Her rush to find a good sleeping place and her disregard for the looming weather had cost her. A big smile, one that she loathed due to its caring yet know-it-all nature, spread across his face. "You'll get it. Took me years before I worked it all out." "Yeah, well, we can't have it all together like you, Abe," Gwendolyn snapped. She didn't mean for that to come out, but it couldn't be helped. She already felt foolish for her mistake. Abe pointing it out made it sting even more. Gwendolyn tried her best never to rely on anyone else. Her heart would be forever filled with thanks to those who helped her survive, but she wished to be strong enough on her own. A life of struggle and suffering forced her into something she knew she could never have been with living parents, and she longed to embrace that identity. Gwendolyn wanted to feed that strength until it flourished into something that took her to far greater heights than a lowly and nameless orphan. "I'm sorry," she blurted, not wanting him to leave. "What are you doing out here?" "Right. I figured someone would be down here. Mrs. Welser is offering food and shelter tonight for anyone who can make it. She sent me out to find every one I could and bring them back before the food got cold. It's stew tonight, so we need to get our fill. Drown and Battle are already there, and I'm not going any further than the docks in this weather, so let's get out of here. Anyone else around?" "No, I don't think so." Abe nodded and extended his hand. Gwen took it, and he led her through the winding Timlin streets. Abandon weaved and turned as though he read a map while running through the heavy storm. Gwendolyn knew the general direction to Mrs. Welser's home, but it would have taken her twice as long to find it without Abe guiding her. Finally, they stopped in front of the familiar door. At least Mrs. Welser's home had an overhang that shielded them from the pouring rain while they waited to get inside. Heavy and thick wooden slats held together by intricate iron hinges stood in a double-wide doorway into the massive home. Mrs. Welser's wealth rivaled that of the city's treasury itself, and it quite showed in her illustrious residence. Her husband was a businessman by trade, and a very savvy one at that. He often traveled to other cities, even kingdoms, for business ventures, often capitalizing on the wanton desires of other rich families. Gwendolyn heard many stories of Mr. Welser's trips, which filled her head with dreams of riches and comforts that remained foreign to her. Abe reached out and took hold of the large ring-shaped knocker and clacked it against the metal plate 3 times. Gwendolyn eagerly watched the door, waiting for that dazzling light to emanate from the inside of Mrs. Welser's gorgeous home, and to see her warming smile. The door swung open wide, and an older woman whose face carried a timeless beauty peered out into the darkness. "Kelwyn, dear, I told you not to wait out in the cold rain. Quickly, come inside." Gwendolyn snickered. Though none of the orphans used each other's actual names, Mrs. Welser insisted on it, believing names should remain a part of each one of them. Despite her best efforts to suppress it, hearing Abe's true name always made her laugh. He shot her a frown as she closely followed him through the closing doors. Sorry, Mrs. Welser, I don't get invited inside anyone else's home. Can't help it, said Abe. A hint of sadness entered the old woman's eyes. I know, Kelvin. I wish it were not a habit that needed to be broken. Come into the dining hall. Charlot and Hathan could not wait any longer. The poor dears haven't been able to find much food lately. Timlin guards have become increasingly strict concerning citizens leaving food on the streets. Claims of rodent infestation may fool some, but they do not fool me. I fear, children, that, to save their reputation as the trading hub of the known lands, many of the Shining City's leaders aim to end another perceived problem, yet they will do it without mercy. While Mrs. Welser flowed with kindness and compassion, her husband never approved of her using their money to feed poor and hungry orphans. No one knew when exactly Mrs. Welser first started helping Timlin's orphans, but she was always forthcoming about her husband's disapproval. That is why it was only when Mr. Welser traveled that she was able to open her doors. Even then, she could only do it during night when her gossiping neighbors were already asleep. Of course, all the orphans adored her so much no one would dare say anything to get her in trouble, and thereby ruin their chances of having a decent meal and a good night's rest. Abe engaged her in conversation, as he often did. Gwendolyn had to give him credit. He kept himself informed rather well, which was why many others looked to him as a leader. Gwendolyn's attention tore away from the two as they all walked toward the dining room. She had been in this home many times, and yet each time she visited, it impressed her all over again. A roaring fire, which immediately dispelled the chill of the wet still clinging to her, breathed heat throughout the main entryway. 2 large chairs rested on a sprawling rug in front of the hearth, tempting Gwendolyn to forgo the food and curl up amidst the warmth. Mrs. Welser would let her if she asked, but her stomach protested at the thought. Masterfully crafted woodwork lined the walls and ceiling, contrasting the coldness of the beautiful marble floors that cast each footstep into an empty echo. Stone staircases with similar carved wooden rails led to the mysterious second floor. No one went up there, but no one needed to either. Soon 2 energetic voices filled Gwendolyn's ears. A boy with dark shaggy hair sitting at the end of an elongated banquet table laughed with glee as the adjacent girl buried her face in a bowl of stew and proceeded to bellow a jaunty tune, turning it into a garbled echo of noises. Mrs. Welser stopped short and burst out with an amused cackle at the sight. Lifting her face, now spattered with stew juice, the girl looked nervously at her hostess. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Welser. She stuttered. Mrs. Welser came up from nearly doubling over and waved off the young girl. "My dear Charlot, do not apologize. You should see your face. Quite the performance. Perhaps one day you will find yourself among the bards of Timlin." The girl took the cloth napkin at her side and vigorously wiped away the mess. She turned to Abe. "Did you find anyone else?" "Just one," he replied. Gwendolyn stepped out from behind him and Mrs. Welser. "Bandit!" screeched the boy. Gwendolyn knelt down as the boy jumped from his chair and rushed over to her. He was only a couple of years younger than her, but he was short for his age. "Battle, good to see you, little buddy." He gripped her wet, tattered clothes and pulled her close as she squeezed him tight. Gwendolyn looked up to see Drown's surprised face. She, too, jumped from her chair and rushed over, grasping her neck and holding her as close as Battle continued to hold her. "Oh, Bandit, I thought I'd lost you." "What's that?" chimed in Abe. Drown released Gwendolyn and frowned at him. "I told you, 2 weeks ago we were trying to catch fish in the Stysis River when that fight broke out between a band of thieves and the Timlin Guard. We got separated. I thought she was killed. Did you know she was alive?" The two often fought. Gwendolyn suspected it was because they were so close in age and equally stubborn, but Mrs. Welser told her once that it was because they liked each other. Gwendolyn wasn't so sure about that. "I told you I've seen her plenty. You don't listen. You never said anything about Bandit since that day," she barked. "Children, please," Mrs. Welser interjected. "We mustn't let the food get cold. You may bicker later if you must, but for now, sit down and I will bring you your food. Charlot and Hathan, may I top off your bowls?" Drown nodded with quick jerks of her head. "Yes, please, ma'am." "Another biscuit?" pleaded Battle, looking up at her with large brown eyes. "Of course, my dear. Now please, go sit," said Mrs. Welser as she shooed them all to the end of the banquet table. Glad you're okay, Drown whispered in Gwendolyn's ear. Gwendolyn nodded. Sorry to worry you. Couldn't escape, so I played dead. Good idea, she replied with a wink. Have to remember that one next time. Gwendolyn sat down in one of the tall wooden chairs. Despite their rigid appearance, they were quite comfortable. She often thought she could fall asleep in one if she ever needed to. Mrs. Welser brought their food out, and Gwendolyn dug in, quickly making a second and smaller third helping disappear. As much as she enjoyed food, she felt more than ready for the next part of her hostess's generosity. Mrs. Welser handed each of them nightgowns, which fit comfortably, then directed them to the guest bedroom. At least that was what she called it. Really, it was more of an accommodating residence within the manor meant for housing an entire guest family. After changing into the nightgowns, they all buried themselves underneath heavy quilted covers in beds of their own. Little Battle fell fast asleep almost immediately, and the other two stayed awake, talking past Gwendolyn's memory of the night. The now past storm took a lot out of her before Abe's rescue, and she surrendered to her fatigue, ready to follow Battle into sweet rest. Mrs. Welser tucked them each in, and Gwendolyn barely remembered murmuring words of gratitude before the kind woman snuffed out the last lit candle in the room. As her consciousness faded, a hint of sadness came through in Mrs. Welser's final words for the evening. Of course, dear Gwendolyn. If only I could do more. Quieted voices woke Gwendolyn. She sat up, squinting away the sunlight bursting through the open windows. 3 beds lay unmade without their occupants. Gwendolyn cursed her luck. Normally, they all left together, early in the morning, to protect Mrs. Welser's reputation, though she never asked for it. By the sun's angle, it had to be coming upon mid-morning, and it would be harder to sneak out and away from prying eyes. The bright light caused a tickle to creep up Gwendolyn's nose. She tried to stifle it, but the sneeze came out anyway, and the voices cut short. Mrs. Welser rushed in, ecstatic. Oh, sweet Gwendolyn, I do apologize for not waking you with the others. I could tell you were in dire need of rest, but fortune has found you because of it. I received the most unexpected guests this morning. My, how I was afraid, but it has turned out more wondrous than I could ever expect. Gwendolyn found herself scooted back to the head of the bed at Mrs. Welser's unusual behavior. She proved herself more cheerful than most women her age, but this seemed quite out of character. Do not be frightened, my dear, Mrs. Welser said, noticing Gwendolyn's expression. I will let them explain. Please, dear, stay a moment. Mrs. Welser rushed out and came back with 2 finely dressed individuals, followed by 6 guards. The man wore rugged brown hair, and a short mop atop his head swept to one side its natural waviness, forcing a slightly disheveled appearance. His brown leather overcoat with faded yellow trim at the sleeves and lapels hung loose down his torso, golden buttons shimmering in the sunlight. Underneath, a patterned powder blue vest sat neatly buttoned over a white stock. His tall black leather boots stomped on the hard wooden floors as he strode in with an air of undeserved sense of authority. The woman wore a dress littered with sparkling fabric woven into it, and moved as softly as if she rode atop a cloud. Hair white as snow sat in an immaculate bun atop her head, while long, graceful strands draped down the sides of her still youthful face. The guard stood by the door, the man stood by the foot of the bed, and the woman sat down beside Gwendolyn. Her life on the streets of Timlin threw her into a state of panic. The only experience she had with the rich and powerful, aside from Mrs. Welser, was that of mistreatment. Commoners weren't so bad. However, the rich always made it a point to shove her to the side, throw rotted food at her for sport, make her go diving in freezing water for a single gold coin they knew she couldn't pass up. Some even promised payment for chores, only to laugh at her gullibility and send her away empty-handed once she finished. Do you know who I am, child? She asked, smiling. Gwendolyn swallowed. The smile was not one of compassion, but rather it was stretched and forced as though some vague intention lay behind it. She had seen the same one often enough. She leaned further back, fear building, and said nothing. Mrs. Welser sounded convinced of something great, and yet Gwendolyn could not help but to feel unsettled by the woman's tone. I am Sovereign Tuli Athaliason of Timlin. Rumors have reached my ears of a citizen within our very walls that helps those less fortunate. I, too, would like to help. The sovereign reached for Gwendolyn's hand, and when she pulled it back, the imposing woman snatched it up, then let her grip loosen into a gentle cradle. As it were, my husband and I have been blessed by Isilstra with only a single beautiful daughter. The castle is such a lonely place for a small child. Our daughter Solana desperately needs a friend, and you, dear, are in desperate need of a home. Will you not come? We will give you all the food you need. You will have clothes to wear. You need not worry about your health or safety any longer, and you will have the wealth and power of the sovereign house at your fingertips. My child, will you allow your sovereign and her husband to adopt you as their own? And that is chapter 1 of Secrets of a Broken Lineage. So I hope you enjoyed that. Hopefully I didn't mess up too much. But if you enjoyed it, check it out. I'll put the link to Amazon, where you can pick up a copy of your own ebook, paperback, or hardcover, if you want to read more. Thanks for listening in, and we'll catch you in the next video.